Welcome back to the Argue With Me podcast. In this episode, I have with me Ilya Somin from GMU, and he's written an article in National Affairs, The Case Against Nationalism. Neither of us are fans of nationalism. We get into what is nationalism anyway? Why is it bad? Is it the same thing as just being proud of one's country? The answer turns out to be no. So please stick around. I love listening to Ilya. He packs a lot of information into very, very tight spaces of time, as you'll see. So yeah, I hope you enjoy the episode. Thanks. All right, welcome to the Argue With Me podcast. Today, I'm delighted to say that I have with me Ilya Somin, who is a professor of law at George Mason and also the Simon Chair of Constitutional Studies at Cato. I get that one right, that last one?
Simon Chair in constitutional studies, but perhaps there's not much difference between of constitutional studies and in constitutional studies.
Well, that's just like a law professor to point out that change in verbiage, so that's fine.
That's why they pay me the big bucks.
Okay, perfect. So, uh, I'm very happy to have you on, and I want to talk to you about an article that you co-wrote with Alex, and I'm sorry if I get the last name wrong, but I think it's Norwestay. Did I get
Rasta.
Noraste? Okay. I have seen him on several interviews, though I've never heard his name pronounced, but he's always so excellent, I find. I love watching his interviews on YouTube when he's talking about immigration and issues like that. Um, so anyway, you co-wrote this article on nationalism called "The Case Against Nationalism," and I thought the article was wonderful. And it's on nationalaffairs.com, so anybody can find that. Um, so I thought I would just start out by asking you first, why why this topic? Like, why did you guys choose to band together and to write a case against nationalism?
So we both write on issues related to nationalism, including immigration, and in my case, constitutional structure and design. So that's one reason. But the big reason is that if you look at the political right in the United States and in at least some European countries, nationalism has gradually become the dominant ideology, or at least close to the dominant ideology of the political right today, as opposed to, say, 10, 20 years ago, when the dominant ideology of the political right, at least in the US and in many European countries, was more free market oriented conservatism, or you could characterize it in other ways, but nationalism was less central to it. And finally, we decided to write about this because nationalism, both historically and today, is a terrible ideology that's extremely dangerous. It is probably second only to socialism in terms of the amount of harm that it has caused over the last 100 years and more.
Okay, fair enough. Well put. Now, what I guess the next natural question that somebody might have is like, well, what exactly do you mean by nationalism? I mean, how is this different from patriotism or uh, that sort of thing? What is nationalism that you're writing about?
It's a good question. Nationalism, like other terms denoting political ideologies like socialism, conservatism, liberalism, libertarianism, there are a number of possible definitions. We chose one that I think captures the essence of the major movements that we're looking at now, and also what more intellectual defenders of nationalism usually defend, which is the idea that the nation and its government are supposed to serve a particular ethnic or racial or cultural group and its culture, and promote the interests of that culture and ethnic group, and that should be its main objective. And nationalists generally are not hesitant to use coercion of various kinds to advance that objective. It's distinct from patriotism, which could be loyalty to a country, but that loyalty can be based on various different kinds of grounds, some of which have nothing to do with ethnicity or culture. And it's distinct from other kinds of what we might call right-wing ideologies, like conservative traditionalism, for example, which may be nationalistic but need not be.
All right. So, you said in there that in a nationalist structure, words to this effect, um, there's this idea that we have a particular ethnicity and we're going to put their needs forward first. Can you give me some examples of what that looks like and where that might be happening?
Sure. If you look at various nationalist movements have arisen in the US and Europe in recent years and throughout history, this is exactly what they do. In France, the National Front, for example, which now has a different name, says, we want France for the French. We want to protect the interest of ethnically French people, promote their culture, including by force, and where necessary, restrict and suppress opposing cultures, keep out immigrants that they think are culturally inimical. And we have a similar trend with Trumpism in the United States, where Trump has explicitly said that he's a nationalist. And when he talks about what the United States is about, it's about protecting a particular ethnic and cultural identity, and to avoid what he calls poisoning the blood by, which he claims immigration does. And this manifests most obviously in immigration policy, but it also manifests in trade policy in attempts to suppress various cultural developments that nationalists don't like, and in other areas as well.
Yeah, it's interesting as you're talking about France and uh, this sort of national identity issue. So I'm Canadian, just so you know. I think I've told you that before. But I start to think about Quebec as soon as I hear about that because we've had several. I'm not going to ask you to comment on Canadian politics, but just to show that this exists in several places around the world. I mean, we've had several issues, including Quebec going for a referendum to leave Canada on the basis that they're a distinct nation. And Quebec is unlike other provinces, not just because it's francophone, but because it also has stricter. Um, Actually, let me put it this way: they're more zealous about enforcing cultural norms.
Yeah,
Sign, yeah,
I'm familiar with it. And
yeah,
Francois Legault's government in Quebec, leading the Coalition Avenir Quebec Party,
yes.
is in fact a very good example of a nationalist government, which, for example, suppresses in various ways the use of the English language in public spaces, tries to restrict immigration to what they regard as sufficiently francophone people, and so forth. So yes, Canada has a sort of somewhat different situation in the US because Francophone Canadian nationalism differs in certain ways from the Anglophone version, and nationalist forces, at least currently, are much more prominent and politically successful in Quebec than in the rest of Canada. But it is certainly true that this set of issues is not unique to the United States, sort of France or to some other European countries. It exists in Canada as well. And Quebec, I think, is the most obvious flashpoint, at least in recent years, where you see this kind of thing in Canada.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you're saying like it's changing right-wing politics away from a typical sort of market viewpoint or more conservative viewpoint. And but I guess it doesn't just get sort of barricaded to right-wing politics. Quebec, you'd be hard pressed to call Quebec a very right-wing province in some ways. I mean, it's extremely socialist. I mean, people don't even usually bat an eye about socialist ideas there. It's been like that forever, or for
Sure.
decades,
So
right?
I think
Yeah.
the term I would use here is more statist than socialist, in that there are right and left-wing forms of statism. Speaking somewhat crudely and oversimplifying, left-wing socialist statism, the ideology behind it is the idea that we need extensive government control of the economy in order to benefit the poor, the disadvantaged, and alike, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or culture. So left-wing socialist statism, by and large, is a cosmopolitan ideology that doesn't distinguish between races, cultures, ethnicities, and the like. On the other hand, right-wing nationalism also has a very strong element of statism that we talk about in our article with respect to protectionism, immigration restrictions, industrial policy, and so forth. But the rationale for it is not to help sort of an international working class or to help the disadvantaged generally. It's rather to ensure that the government benefits the favored racial, ethnic, or cultural group. In Quebec, at least under more nationalist provincial governments, the rationale for government intervention historically is that it's needed to advance the interest of Francophone Quebecois rather than those of the working class as such, or those of poor people generally. And in many cases, you end up with relatively similar policies with right-wing nationalist statism as you do with left-wing statism, but there can be differences as well. One of which is that under right-wing nationalist version, they're much more open about being willing to use the heavy-handed government to engage in racial or ethnic favoritism, whereas left-wing socialist statism, at least historically, has been more committed to ideals of non-discrimination and inclusiveness. There is some complexity here with now sort of left-wing identity politics, which could have its own whole separate discussion. But left-wing identity politics usually, at least in Western nations, is deployed not on behalf of having a single overarching group that should define the dominant culture of the nation, but rather for helping what they perceive as historically disadvantaged groups like African Americans in the US. I know obviously, in Canada, there's, debates about this as well with I think the Canadian term is First Nations, if I remember
Yeah.
correctly.
Yeah.
So there is certainly left-wing ethnic identity politics, but in most cases, at least in Western nations, it is not oriented towards enforcing a single dominant culture on everybody. It's oriented to helping what they think of as disadvantaged minority groups.
Right. So, could any of this explain? Maybe this is an intuitive way to look at it for someone like me. Like I remember when I was a kid that the knock on Republicans, and this is mostly from like 1980 sitcoms where what's his name? Michael J. Fox plays a young Republican or something, right? And
Alex
it's like,
Keaton.
yeah, Alex Keaton, you love banks and business and that sort of thing, and you hate workers. Like you don't care about the little guy. That was always the knock, whether true or not. Now it seems like somebody like Trump is just as willing to talk about workers as someone on the left, as long as they're of a certain persuasion, of course, right? So is this
Yes.
how it's so is it nationalism that explains this flip in talking points there where the right is adopting some of what the left talks about, but only in particular circumstances or
Yes. I think the trend towards nationalism is a big part of what's behind the greater economic interventionism of, say, the Republican Party today compared to 10 or 20 years ago. More nationalistic Republicans like Trump, J.D. Vance, and others will openly talk about how they don't like large corporations, and they would denounce the
yeah.
corporate media, and even corporate Republicans, or what they call zombie Reaganism, meaning old style, more free market conservatism. And they will say we're working to protect the working class, but what they mean by that in most cases is workers of a particular background and culture, as opposed to a kind of sort of undifferentiated international working class of the kind that Marxists or other more traditional socialists said that they were trying to help.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so is this the type of thing that you're terming nationalist economics in your article? It's just these
Yes,
policies that flow
so
from it.
the nationalists favor highly interventionist economic policies. We talked about some of them: severe immigration restrictions, trade protectionism, industrial policy to promote favored firms in various industries and the like. And while the ideological rationale for this is somewhat different than that of left-wing policies that may look similar, the problems here, nonetheless, that result are nonetheless much the same. One is you need a lot of coercion to have these policies, which can inflict a lot of harm. A second is there are two classic weaknesses of socialism pointed out by economists, which also apply to nationalist economic interventionism. One is that the government lacks the knowledge to determine how much we should produce in a given industry, or how many workers we should allow or not allow, or when foreign products might be better than domestically made ones. And that knowledge cannot suddenly be increased merely because you're flying a nationalist flag as opposed to a red socialist flag. The second problem is that these policies require an enormous concentration of power, and that creates very bad incentives. The politicians, interest groups, and others who wield this power, they can abuse it in various ways. Even though democracy imposes perhaps some oversight on this, voters often have little idea of what's going on. I've written a whole book about political ignorance
Yeah.
called Democracy and Political Ignorance, which covers this. And in addition, the more government controls various parts of the economy, whether it controls it for socialist ideological reasons or nationalist ones, the more it can use that to impose political controls of various kinds as well and make it harder for opposition to organize. And when you look at the history of nationalist economic policies, it is not a history of enriching the working class, even that of the dominant group. It is a history of poverty and failure. The history of Argentina, with its decades of right-wing nationalist economic policies, it went from one of the richest nations in the world to being a relative economic basket case. What happens in countries like Spain, Portugal, and others, which followed these policies for long periods of time, is also terrible. And of course, in the more extreme cases, you get various forms of fascism, where in addition to economic harm, you also get massive oppression. When nationalism has reared its head in American history, the oppression has been less, but still quite severe in many cases, as with cruel policies towards Asian immigrants in the 19th and early 20th century, and trade protectionism, which caused enormous harm and contributed to the Great Depression. And there are many other examples as well.
So, okay, it's interesting. Look, you know how when people say, "Oh, we want to implement this social policy here, this social policy there," and you can tell them, "Well, I mean, look at all the times this has been tried before and how poorly it's worked out in all these other instances." You can do the same thing for nationalism, which you just laid out a case. I mean, look at all these terrible. I just saw an article this morning, actually, a fallout from the Brexit is that Canada and the United Kingdom have to make a new trade deal, which we're having a hard time doing.
Which is falling apart. Yeah.
It's falling apart over beef and cheese, which this can't benefit any consumer in any sense. Um, so what is so appealing about this? Like, why is this
So,
a
so,
thing?
so why do people like it?
Yeah.
I think for a couple reasons. First, obviously, not everybody likes it, and in even in the country we're talking about, these sorts of forces are not the majority, though they are more powerful than they were perhaps a decade or two ago. One reason why they like it is many people don't understand sort of basic economics. That's not because they're stupid, it's because they just haven't taken the time and effort to study it. They have relatively weak incentives to do so. If your only motivation to study economics and other areas of government policy is to be a better voter, that's not much of a motivation at all, because the chance that your vote will change the outcome of an election is infinitesimally small. So one reason is just simple ignorance. People don't understand the economics. They don't know the relevant history. Second, there is a tendency in human psychology known as in-group, out-group dynamics, where we feel like we're suspicious of outsiders, and also there's a tendency to think that the world is a zero-sum game. So as Donald Trump says, if the U.S. has a trade deficit with another country like Japan or Mexico or Canada, then they're winners and we're losers. That's total BS from the standpoint of basic economics, but it makes intuitive sense to many people. And when you combine that with the suspicion of outsiders, you get nationalist movements. Finally, nationalism and other movements that emphasize ethnic or group conflict and that have a zero-sum mentality are more likely to arise during periods of relatively slow growth, when people are more likely to think that the world is a zero-sum game and that my group can only gain if others lose, and vice versa. And in the years after the financial crisis of 2008, we did have relatively slow growth, both in the US and in various European nations. The aftermath of the pandemic, we've had fast growth, but we also had the period of severe inflation. In some European countries, growth has actually been relatively slow as well, on top of the inflation. That hasn't everywhere led to nationalist movements. Fortunately, in Canada, other than Quebec, it so far has not to a great extent, but it has bolstered them in many places, as you can look back at previous periods of economic stagnation in the late 19th century and in the 1930s, that also gave boosts to this kind of nationalism as well. Even though nationalism doesn't actually make these situations better, many people have an intuitive sense that that it should.
Yeah, it's interesting too that there's like, I don't know, very little social cost to just calling yourself a nationalist in general. I don't know why that blind spot sort of exists. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but
Yeah.
it's just that people don't know.
So uh, I think uh, in American politics, at least until recently, it has not been common for people to call themselves nationalists, but increasingly on the right, people do. And the term does not have sort of that much of a stigma associated with it. And for some people, more so in Europe, there is a sense that, if you're a nationalist, that means you're championing the interest of the nation. So what could be bad about that? So in Europe, calling yourself a nationalist in many countries is even more advantageous than the US, because in the US we are historically a very multi-ethnic nation. So when you hear about nationalism, there isn't, there is a question, well, who are the true Americans? How do we figure out who those people are? Is it, the white people, the white Christians? Is it Anglo-Saxons? It's some other kind of group. Whereas in many European countries, there is more of a historical sense that there is one group that the nation is supposed to be about, the ethnically French people, uh, ethnic Germans, ethnic Swedes or Spaniards or whatnot. And therefore, there is more, not for everybody, of course, but for many people, there's more of a positive resonance.
Right. Yeah, that explains it. Yeah, I guess so it's a depending on where you are, you might not pay a social cost if you call yourself a
Sure.
nationalist. Yeah. Um, all right, so we know what nationalism is. We know sort of why people are attracted to it. What's the th it, we mentioned not everybody likes this stuff. In fact, thank
Sure.
God most people don't. At least the majority. I guess it's not a large majority, or we wouldn't be worrying about it too much. What are the numbers like in this threat, of nationalism coming to the fore?
So I guess it depends on what you who in the general public you define as a nationalist, and most people in the general public won't necessarily clearly say I'm a nationalist, or for that matter, I'm a liberal or a conservative or something else. And a lot of survey research shows most people have only a vague idea of what these sorts of terms mean. But depending on the issue, in the US and in various European countries, and to some extent in Canada, at least in Quebec, but perhaps in some areas of English Canada as well. There are a substantial number of people who believe various nationalist tropes about how immigration is a great menace, that we need protectionism to protect domestic industries, that we need more national economic planning and the like, and also there are a good many people who worry about cultural erosion of various kinds, that the culture they know and love, or at least that they think they know and love, might no longer be the dominant culture. And depending on which survey instruments you use and which of these things you measure, it could be anywhere from for some of these things, maybe 20, 25% to 40, 50% and the like. And obviously in the middle on these issues and a lot of other issues, there's a lot of people who don't necessarily have very strong and firm views, but a sense of a crisis situation and the like can swing them one way or another. And in the US two-party system, if a relatively nationalist faction gains control of one of the two major parties, as at least to a significant extent it has with the Republican Party, it can come to power not because a majority of the population necessarily supports all their ideas, but because people don't like the other party, for example, or just want to vote against the incumbent. Like right now, President Biden is pretty unpopular. Many of the reasons why he's unpopular have nothing to do with people thinking he's not nationalist enough or something like that. They're just people being angry about things like
Yeah.
inflation. But nonetheless, when one of the two major parties is to a large extent controlled or at least heavily influenced by a movement like this, that movement can have a lot of clout because that party will be in power in Congress and in the White House very roughly, 50% of the time or something like that. And so these movements, like other movements, don't necessarily have to have a majority in order to wield significant influence.
And like how far would the worries go if nationalism, whether people know they're being nationalist or not, as you point out, sort of irrelevant. Just if they get on this bandwagon, they like it aesthetically, and it makes them feel a certain way, and it emboldens them. Um, like, is the worry that this could seriously undermine the way that the United States operates and has operated for, a couple hundred
I'm sorry.
years,
I,
or
I,
how?
this, your sound has gone off.
Oh, can you hear me? Seems like my. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Not sure what that was. Sorry, I'll just repeat the. Oh, I see. My internet connection is unstable. Sorry. Give it 1 second and I'll just cut this out when they. All right. So what I was asking was, how deep does the worry go about nationalism if you have all these people who are, without necessarily ex adopting the label and theory of nationalism, but just intuitively they're enjoy the aesthetic. They're caught up in the movement of this right-wing nationalism. Is the worry that something like, and I'm going to get this date wrong because I'm Canadian, but was it January 6th that the insurrection on
You
the
have it right, January
uh,
6th,
okay,
2021.
okay, is it the worry that stuff like that's going to keep happening but get worse, or what is the ultimate worry here?
So there are there's a number of different worries. Obviously, in the most extreme cases, when nationalist movements have come to power in various countries, they have destroyed democracy, suppressed opposition, and committed mass murder. The Nazis are the most extreme example, but there are many, many others, including more recent cases like Vladimir Putin in Russia, Orban in Hungary, the case of Turkey, and there are lots of other examples historically and around the world. When you believe that the country and the government should be organized around protecting one particular ethnic or cultural group, then there is a fundamental sense that we should limit the access of other groups to power, and even that if you lose an election, it must be illegitimate somehow because your group is the one, your party, your movement is the one that represents the real French, the real Hungarians, or the real Americans. And this is part of what underlies Trump's election denialism about 2020. Some of it is idiosyncratic to him and to various particular aspects of the American political system, like the Electoral College. But some of it is the sense, well, if my movement loses, it's because of illegitimate factors like immigrants voting illegally or nefarious elites, using fraud to block the movement. And this is not unique to Trump. You see similar claims around the world by nationalist movements. And nationalist movements often have a tendency to glorify and deify their leaders. The deification of Trump within the Republican Party is an example of this, but there are many other historical examples: Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, many others. And that too has authoritarian and anti-democratic tendencies of various kinds. So in the more extreme cases, which are far from entirely uncommon, you get the destruction of democracy and the rise of authoritarianism and severe repression. In less extreme cases, democracy is largely at least preserved, but you get cruel and oppressive policies like Donald Trump's family separation, or earlier in American history, various kinds of discrimination against racial and ethnic minorities, particularly including immigrant minorities, or like what we were talking about earlier with the laws in Quebec trying to suppress the use of the English language in public settings, discriminating against non-francophones and so on. And you also, of course, get what we talked about earlier, harmful economic policies, which end up impoverishing not just minority group members or particular or immigrants, but also natives, including those who belong to the supposedly privileged and dominant group. If you, for instance, keep out immigrants who disproportionately contribute to economic and scientific progress, that obviously hurts the immigrants themselves, but it also hurts the natives. For instance, immigrants disproportionately contribute to medical progress, including vaccination and various innovations of various kinds. If you keep out more of those people, more natives will get sick and die of diseases that otherwise they could have been saved from. And that's just one of many effects like this. And obviously, you get slower economic growth, which is harmful for all of society, not just minority groups or immigrants and the like. If you have protectionism, like the kind you were talking about before, that impoverishes consumers. In Canada, you have the supply management system, which is great for a small number of interest groups, big farmers and the like. But Canadians, when they go to the supermarket, they pay more for basic food products,
Yeah.
which is particularly bad for the relatively poor. And of course, in other countries, including the US, we have similarly perverse policies in some areas. And the more nationalism grows, the more of that you are likely to see.
So there's just three more things I wanted to ask you about, and
Sure.
actually there were two, but I thought of something while you were talking just now. I don't know if you want to critique this thought because it seems almost like people knock the left, like specifically, let's take communism, and they'll go, well, the problem with communism is you're asking people to behave against their own interests or to behave against human nature, or this type of thing, which I think to a degree is true, although not the only problem with communism. But it seems more like this right nationalism is like you're asking people to give in to their most base, ancient, tribal instincts. So it's like a really easy sell, eh? There's a sales pitch that doesn't even have to happen there, I guess, for a lot of people. Um, is that a fair assessment of the difference
Yeah.
in the?
So part of the political advantage that nationalists have, or at least sometimes have, is that they do appeal to sort of instinctive feelings that have roots in human nature that many people have. However, it's worth noting that people's instincts don't necessarily have to be channeled into nationalism. They could be channeled into other things like family life, religion, various other kinds of commitments. And we do have a history in the United States, but also in other countries, of successful movements for equal rights, which point out how distinctions that may seem very significant at first are actually insignificant or misguided, like the movement for equality for blacks, for instance. For the abolition of slavery. There was the famous image of the chained black slave, which asked, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Right? And the idea here is that there's no fundamental difference between blacks and whites, which justifies enslaving them, but us having freedom. And similarly, we saw later the movement for racial equality, the movement for women's equality, for equality for gays and lesbians. All of them emphasize this point that what there's a common humanity, and these differences, which may seem really important when you think about them more carefully, they're not as significant as it looks. And I would suggest that whether somebody is born south of the Rio Grande River or north of the Rio Grande River is also a morally relevant characteristic, one that you cannot control, similar to being born black or being born white. Or in an earlier era in Western history, we allowed people who are nobles to move around freely, but not people who are serfs. And we all recognize now that's arbitrary. Like, it can't be the case that just because your father or mother was a serf, you should have less freedom than somebody who was born a noble. So I think we can make progress on that front. We can also, to some extent, make progress simply by having more economic growth. There's a little bit of a chicken and egg in that preventing nationalist economic policies is one of the ways that we can have more growth. So it is true, they do appeal to aspects of human nature. And while I think it is correct to say the communists were wrong to claim you can create a new socialist man that magically would disappear all of the negative attributes of what they thought of as capitalist man, we shouldn't go to the other extreme and say, well, all natural impulses should always be indulged. For instance, there is a lot of evidence that people, particularly males, have some natural impulses towards violence. But that doesn't mean we should say, well, if you're being violent, that's fine. That's just that's what being a man is all about. I think most of us would reject that idea. And similarly, some impulses that tend towards nationalist or racial or ethnic oppression and the like, or sexism and so forth, we want to control those impulses. That's what the Enlightenment of liberalism was about, and it has been tremendously successful in many ways, though obviously its success is imperfect, and challengers do arise. In many ways, modern nationalism is part of the reaction against the Enlightenment, arising first in the 19th century and continuing on. And we have at various times managed to defeat or at least constrain these primordial reactions against the Enlightenment, and we can do it again, though it isn't necessarily easy and success isn't guaranteed.
Defeat the primordial reactions against the Enlightenment. I think I want to put that on a t-shirt. If I do,
Don't know
I'll
if it
let
would
you know.
sell a lot of copies, but
Yeah.
uh,
I like it.
we can try.
That may be an album cover or something. That's a good one. So okay, so second to last question I had for you was what did Hayek think of all of this? How is he in particularly like a good analyst of this trend?
Yeah. So Hayek had an essay called Why I Am Not a Conservative, which makes many points. But one of them is that in his view, conservatism is often associated with nationalism, and he was very much hostile to nationalism because, as he recognized in that essay, in nationalism is generally associated with collectivism and with extreme government intervention. And he also emphasized in that essay that we should judge ideas and trends on their merits, not on what country they arise in or what are the ethnicity or race of the people who come up with them. So as he says that the claim that an idea is un-German or un-American is no real argument against it. You want to see, is it a good idea? Is it sound? And Hayek, therefore, was very critical of nationalism. And of course, Hayek was from Austria and left Austria as it was becoming fascist and eventually, of course, fell under the control of Nazi Germany. So that experience, I think, stayed with him as it also influenced his mentor, Ludwig von Mises, who, of course, was a German Jew who fled Nazism. So the early to mid 20th Austrian economists who were among the founders of modern classical liberalism or libertarianism, whichever term you want to use. They certainly knew that nationalism was terrible. They had personally experienced how awful it was, and they were almost as critical of it as they were of left-wing socialism, even though their critique of left-wing socialism is more famous. But Hayek's essay, Why I Am Not a Conservative, remains very much relevant to this debate. There are some aspects of conservatism that he talks about in that essay that are not nationalistic, and you can quibble whether conservatism must necessarily be not nationalistic. I think there are variants of conservatism which are not, but to the extent that some variants are, they are very subject to the critique that Hayek made.
Yeah, what a smart guy, eh? I wonder if anybody's ever noticed that how smart he anyway.
He was obviously he was a very smart man.
Yeah, yeah,
Not all of his thought was equally good, but why I'm not a conservative is a classic essay that I think is very much worth reading in our time.
yeah. Okay, so just so we can wrap up here, although I could ask you questions about this for all day. Um, I guess the natural place would be what can we realistically do about this? What's the most effective way to prevent a nationalist movement before it gets out of hand, obviously?
Sure. So I'm not an expert in short-term political strategy, and the optimal strategy is going to vary somewhat by the political system and particular historical situation. So all I can do is give a few pieces of general advice rather than saying like, this is, what particular politicians or activists should do in the next election or something like that. One is it's good to maintain steady and strong economic growth because that reduces the appeal of nationalist movements. It's good to maintain it actually for other reasons too. A second is to be aware of the threat of nationalism, the people who favor universal values, both on the center and left, but also libertarians and classical liberals. Some of people of that view, which I am myself, are very aware of the threat of nationalism, but there are others who tend to be blind to it. It's for those who are blind to it, it's time to drop the scales from your eyes and see that this menace is out there, and that you should not have an attitude of no enemies on the right, even though there are certainly ideological trends in the political left, which also deserve critique and opposition. And then finally, I think we should learn from the successes of past movements for equal rights and for expanding liberty. I mentioned a couple of them already: the abolition of slavery, the abolition of segregation in the United States, movements for gender equality and for gay and lesbian rights, which emphasize successfully the common humanity of people and how differences which may at first seem like they're extremely important actually are not, or at least much less significant than people claim they are. There was great success achieved over time by that path, whereas today, some people, not all by any means, but some people on the left who argue for equal rights for minorities, immigrants, and the like, they have taken the sort of left-wing forms of identity politics, which, in addition to being logically flawed in various ways, also are far less likely to appeal to to members in a majority group that you want to persuade. That if Martin Luther King had said, what we really want is a special status for Blacks where everybody has to love and respect their culture and they need to be treated differently, from other groups, that would have been much less successful than the appeal that he actually made, where he said, we should judge people by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. And Similarly, if the anti-slavery movement emphasized that Blacks are a special and distinct group, that would have been much less effective than what they actually did. And I could go on with other historical examples like this. So there is a lesson there for how to organize your movement against nationalism, and we should not fight nationalism with our own identity politics of minority groups. We should fight it with the universal values of the Enlightenment, which have, in many instances, not at all, but in many, triumphed against these kinds of repressive and exclusionary movements before.
If only we were all Vulcans, that would just
So
resolve
if we
all.
were
Yeah.
Vulcans,
Yeah.
things would be easier. Reason doesn't always prevail. It often fails to do so. But just as we have intuitions and tendencies that lead us to be exclusionary and suspicious of outsiders, we also have some tendencies and intuitions that enable us to recognize common humanity, like that famous poster or image of the chained Black slave, which asks, "Am I not a man or a brother? Am I not a man and a brother?" You don't have to have like a deep understanding of ideology or political theory or whatever to recognize the point of that. And we can make similar points about immigrants, about cultural and ethnic minorities today, and so on.
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay. Um, I'm gonna leave it there then, unless there's anything you want to plug. Where can people find you? Any books you want to mention, any articles coming out, that sort of thing.
Sure. So the article is available at the National Affairs website for free. It's called The Case Against Nationalism. It's also available at the Cato Institute website. If you Google my name, Ilya Somin, Ilya, last name Somin, you can find my website, which has many more of my writings. Particularly relevant to our conversation today is my book, Free to Move, Voting, Migration, and Political Freedom, which applies some of the points that we talked about earlier to the case of both international and domestic barriers to freedom of movement, and argues that those should be, at least in the vast majority of cases, abolished. And I also write regularly for the Volokh Conspiracy blog, Volokh, at the Reason website, where, among other things, I write about this set of issues, as well as a number of other types of legal and political questions as well.
All right, perfect. Well, thanks so much for doing this interview.
Thank you very much for having me.